Screaming doesn't care about tax brackets. When the executive elevator jammed between the 41st and 42nd floors, the sound of the infant's wails hit my skull like a ball-peen hammer. Beside me, the city's most ruthless alpha looked less like a corporate titan and more like a man defusing a bomb with zero training. I didn't want his money. I didn't want his attention. I just wanted the noise to stop. Reaching for that baby was the worst mistake of my life. Fluorescent lights have a specific frequency when they're about to die. It's a low grinding buzz that sits right behind your molars. That's where the headache started pulling at the base of my neck while I waited for the elevator on the 42nd floor. I didn't belong up here. Logistics analysts belonged in the sub-basement where the carpet smelled faintly of mildew and ozone from the server racks. But a missing signature on a manifest had dragged me to the executive suites. It was 6:14 p.m. on a Friday. The air up here was aggressively filtered, stripped of the city's smog, and replaced with a manufactured neutrality that made my generic scent blockers itch fiercely against my scent glands. I rubbed the side of my neck, feeling the dry, flaky skin there. Omegas like me, unbonded, tired, hovering near 30, didn't survive in the corporate ecosystem without a chemical shell. The elevator chimed. The polished steel doors slid open with a whisper. I stepped in my eyes, already dropping to my phone screen, desperate to clock out mentally. But the air inside the car was thick. It was heavy hot and tasted metallic on the back of my tongue. It was the scent of an alpha losing control, not in a predatory way, but in a frantic, cornered animal way. Underneath the sharp, biting ozone of the alpha's distress was something else. Sour milk, talcum powder, damp, overheated skin. Then the noise hit. It was a jagged, wet, breathless shriek. The kind of sound that bypasses the auditory cortex and digs straight into the amygdala. I looked up. Noah Pierce, CEO of Pierce Holdings, stood in the corner of the oversized elevator. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit that probably cost more than my annual salary, but the jacket was bunched awkwardly at the shoulders. Strapped to his chest, looking completely alien against the imported wool, was a high-end tactical-looking baby carrier. Inside it, a tiny, furious mass of pink limbs and dark hair was thrashing. Pierce's jaw was locked so tight, the muscle fluttered wildly beneath his skin. His hands, large and pale, hovered uselessly over the infant, afraid to touch, afraid not to touch. He was bouncing on his heels, a rigid, uncoordinated rhythm that was only making the baby scream louder. "Shh," Pierce ordered. It wasn't a soothing sound. It was a command, a boardroom directive issued to a 3-month-old. "Cease crying. You have been fed. You have been changed." The baby naturally shrieked harder, a terrifying sound that left her gasping for air, her tiny face mottling into a bruised plum color. I stood frozen near the buttons. Pierce's eyes snapped to me. They were a startling icy gray currently blown wide with a manic edge. He didn't see an employee. He barely saw a human. He saw a witness to his profound inadequacy. His scent flared a sharp crack of ozone and burning copper that made my eyes water. The sheer density of his pheromones was pressing against my cheap blockers, making my chest tight. Press the ground floor?" He snapped his voice, a low, vibrating baritone that rattled against the steel walls. I already had. I pointed to the glowing 1 button. The doors began to slide shut. Just as the metal sealed us in the elevator gave a violent, sickening lurch, my stomach dropped into my shoes. The overhead lights flickered, died, and were instantly replaced by the sickly yellow hue of the emergency backups. The hum of the descent stopped. We were suspended somewhere around the 39th floor. Silence stretched for exactly 1 second. Then the baby inhaled a massive gulp of air and let out a wail that felt physically abrasive. Pierce cursed a vicious, breathless sound. He fumbled with the clasps of the carrier, his long fingers clumsy. "Emergency button, press it." I leaned over and slammed the red button. A tinny, automated voice assured us that maintenance had been notified. It could take up to 20 minutes to manually override the system. 20 minutes. The infant screamed. It wasn't just crying anymore. It was an escalating panic. The air in the confined box was growing stagnant, the emergency ventilation failing to clear the suffocating mix of the alpha's spiked stress hormones, and the baby's raw terror. My headache bloomed from a dull throb into a blinding spike of pain right behind my left eye. I watched Pierce unclip the baby, lifting her awkwardly under the armpits. She dangled there, her little legs kicking frantically in the air, her face wet with spit and tears. He held her at arm's length, his face a mask of cold fury, masking sheer panic. "Stop," he told her, his alpha resonance bleeding into the word. It was a frequency meant to force submission in boardrooms, a heavy invisible weight that made my own knees lock instinctively. To an infant, it was just terrifying noise. She choked on her spit, coughing and screaming simultaneously. My blockers were failing. I could feel the biological imperative scratching at the back of my brain, a buried, deeply unwelcome instinct reacting to the distressed pup. I clamped down on it, folding my arms tightly across my chest, digging my nails into my cheap polyester sleeves. Not my problem. Let the billionaire figure it out. 2 minutes passed. 3. Pierce was pacing the 2 square feet available to him. He tried resting her on his shoulder, but he was stiff as a board, patting her back with the rhythmic mechanics of a metronome. His scent was turning acrid, a burning wire smell that made me nauseous. The baby was hyperventilating her tiny chest, heaving irregularly. "You're making it worse," I said. The words slipped out before my brain could stop them. I clamped my mouth shut, but it was too late. Pierce stopped pacing. He turned his head slowly, his gray eyes pinning me to the elevator panel. Under the yellow emergency lights, the dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. He looked exhausted. He looked lethal. "Excuse me?" he said softly. The tone was dangerously soft, a stark contrast to the ringing wails of the child. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I shouldn't have spoken. I was a low-level analyst. He could ruin my life with a phone call. But the noise. God, the noise was drilling through my skull, and the sour, panicked smell of the baby was making my stomach turn. "You're stressed," I said, keeping my voice flat, stripping it of any submissive inflection. "Your scent is everywhere. It's bitter. It's scaring her. You're holding her like she's a defective prototype." Pierce's nostrils flared. A wave of pure, unfiltered alpha dominance rolled off him, heavy enough to make the air feel thick as water. I tasted copper. My knees trembled, a biological betrayal I hated, but I locked my jaw and stared back. I was too tired, too miserable, and in too much pain to cower properly. "And I suppose," Pierce sneered, his grip tightening marginally on the squalling infant, "a logistics clerk knows more about my daughter than I do. I know she's about to make herself throw up if she doesn't catch her breath," I said, watching the baby's face turn an alarming shade of crimson. I sighed, rubbing my temples, letting go of the thin shred of professionalism I had left. "Just give her to me." Pierce froze. The suggestion was absurd, practically offensive in Omegaverse hierarchy. A strange Omega demanding an alpha's pup, especially an alpha of his status. His lip curled, a flash of teeth showing in a snarl born of pure defensive instinct. "Absolutely not." He pulled the baby closer to his chest, sheltering her, even as she continued to shriek against his collarbone. "Fine," I muttered, leaning my head back against the cool metal of the elevator wall and closing my eyes. "Let her blow a blood vessel. I've got Tylenol in my desk. I'll survive the migraine. Can't say the same for your eardrums." The wailing echoed, bouncing off the steel amplifying. It was a wet, ragged sound now. The baby was losing her voice, her cries turning into breathless, raspy squeaks of pure misery. I listened to Pierce's erratic breathing. I heard the rustle of his suit fabric. The smell of his distress grew sharper, shifting from anger to genuine, helpless fear. He was a man who controlled global markets, but he couldn't stop a 7-pound human from self-destructing in his arms. "If you drop her," Pierce's voice was strained, hoarse. "If you do anything, I'm sitting on the floor." I interrupted, sliding down the elevator wall until my cheap trousers hit the linoleum. I crossed my legs, creating a secure lap. "Hand her over." I opened my eyes. Pierce was staring down at me, holding the red-faced infant. His chest heaved. The internal war between his territorial alpha instincts and his desperate need for the crying to stop played out in the tight lines of his face. Slowly, stiffly, he knelt. He didn't hand her to me. He lowered her into my arms, his large hands hovering inches away, ready to snatch her back at the slightest provocation. The moment the baby left his grip, he exhaled a shaky breath, though his eyes never left my face. She was heavy, a solid, damp weight of frantic energy. Her little fists were clenched tight enough to turn her knuckles white, and she reeked of sour formula and sweat. I didn't try to rock her immediately. I just held her against my chest, feeling the frantic, rabbit-fast beating of her heart through her cotton onesie. She arched her back, fighting me, her mouth open in a silent scream as she geared up for another wail. I closed my eyes and did the one thing I swore I'd never do at work. I consciously dropped the psychological barrier holding back my scent. I couldn't wash off the chemical blockers, but I could push past them. It took physical effort, a tightening of the core, and a deliberate relaxation of the scent glands at my neck and wrists. It felt intrusive, exposing. My natural scent seeped out old books, dry earth, and steeped black tea. It was a boring smell, quiet and subdued. No sweet vanilla or blooming roses here, just the scent of a quiet room. I felt the exact second it hit the baby. Her thrashing paused. It wasn't an instant fix, but her nose twitched. The dry, earthy scent cut through the metallic panic of her father's pheromones. I shifted my grip, sliding one hand to support the heavy, lolling weight of her head, and pressed her ear flat against the center of my chest, right over my heart. I began to rock, not my arms, but my whole torso, a slow, deep sway from the hips. Shh, I breathed, keeping my voice at the absolute bottom of my register. Not a hum, just a steady vibration in my chest. She let out a broken sob, a wet, shuddering gasp. She pushed against my sternum with surprisingly strong little hands. I didn't force her down. I just kept up the slow sway, letting my scent pool thickly in the confined space. Dry earth. Quiet tea. I felt a prickle of awareness on my skin. I opened my eyes to find Pierce watching me. He was still kneeling, perfectly still, entirely focused on my hands, my face, and the subtle shift in the air. The manic edge in his gray eyes had sharpened into something calculating. It was deeply unsettling. He wasn't looking at me with gratitude. He was analyzing a mechanism that was currently fixing a problem he couldn't solve. I ignored him, focusing on the damp heat of the infant. It took 5 minutes. 5 long minutes of swaying, of letting her cry herself down from panic to exhaustion. Slowly, the rigid tension in her spine began to melt. Her tiny fists uncurled. The ragged, breathless sobs turned into soft, wet hiccups. Her head grew impossibly heavy against my chest. She rooted blindly for a second, her face smearing spit onto my faded collar, before she let out a long, shuddering sigh and went completely limp. Silence crashed into the elevator. It was deafening. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic puff of the baby's breath against my neck and the distant metallic creak of the elevator cables. My arms ached. My neck felt exposed and vulnerable. I immediately began reining my scent back and pulling the psychological walls up, letting the dull ache of the chemical blockers take over again. I felt dirty, compromised. Pierce hadn't moved. He remained kneeling a foot away from me. The violent ozone smell had faded from the air, replaced by something cooler, darker. Rain on hot asphalt. It was still heavy, still intensely alpha, but the panic was gone. "She's asleep," I whispered, my voice rough. I didn't want to wake her, but I desperately wanted her off me. The biological satisfaction humming in my veins was repulsive to me. Pierce stared at the sleeping infant. His hand twitched, reaching out slowly. His knuckles brushed against my forearm as he traced the curve of his daughter's back. The touch was electric, his skin burning hot against my cool, clammy arm. I flinched, pulling back slightly. Pierce's eyes flicked to mine. They were unreadable. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. I stayed calm, I said dryly, keeping my voice low. "Babies aren't mergers, Mr. Pierce. You can't intimidate them into compliance." A muscle jumped in his jaw. I had crossed a line speaking to him like that, but I was too drained to care. Before he could respond, the overhead lights flickered violently and surged back to blinding life. The elevator groaned, the hum of the machinery vibrating through the floorboards. We were moving again. I immediately shifted forward. "Take her." Pierce hesitated, then slipped his large hands under the baby, lifting her carefully from my chest. She whimpered, shifting in her sleep, but didn't wake. As soon as her weight was gone, I scrambled to my feet, brushing the invisible dust from my slacks, feeling a large wet patch of drool cooling rapidly on my shirt. The elevator pinged, the doors sliding open to the cavernous marble-floored lobby of the ground floor. A small army of security guards and a panicked-looking building manager were waiting. "Mr. Pierce, sir, we are so sorry." Pierce strode past them without a word, the sleeping baby cradled awkwardly but securely against his chest. He didn't look back. He didn't say thank you. He just walked out into the cool evening air, swallowed by his security detail. I let out a long, shaky breath, rubbing the back of my itching neck. My shirt was ruined. I had a pounding migraine. But it was over. I walked out of the building, blending into the rush hour crowd, entirely convinced I would never see the man or his screaming child again. I was an idiot. The next morning, my reality reasserted itself with the comforting dullness of a spreadsheet error. I sat at my desk on the 14th floor. The logistics department was a sprawling, open-plan purgatory of gray cubicles smelling of stale coffee toner ink and the collective resignation of 50 mid-level employees. My head was still throbbing a dull, rhythmic bass line from the chemical hangover of dropping my blockers the night before. I'd scrubbed my neck raw in the shower, reapplying a double dose of the generic gel this morning. My skin felt tight and irritable. Hey, Ethan! My supervisor, a perpetually sweating beta named Greg, leaned over the low partition. "Did you finish the quarterly freight analysis? Running the final macros now," I said, not looking away from the screen. "Give me 10 minutes. "Take your time," Greg said, which meant hurry up. I took a sip of my coffee. It was lukewarm and tasted like burnt plastic. Perfect. Normal. I dragged my mouse across a column of numbers, the events of the elevator ride, already compartmentalized in my brain under bizarre nightmares. Then the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The low hum of 50 keyboards clattering simultaneously stuttered, then died out completely in a wave starting from the entrance. The silence was unnatural, spreading like spilled ink. I frowned, looking up from my monitor. Standing in the doorway of the logistics department was Noah Pierce. He was flanked by the terrified-looking VP of operations, who was wringing his hands. Pierce wasn't looking at him. He was scanning the sea of cubicles with the detached precision of a predator surveying a herd. He wore a navy suit today, immaculately tailored, a stark contrast to the rumpled mess he'd been yesterday. And strapped to his chest, fast asleep in the tactical carrier, was the baby. My stomach plummeted. I instantly slouched in my ergonomic chair, trying to shrink behind my monitors. "Don't see me? Don't see me." Pierce's icy gray eyes stopped sweeping the room. They locked dead onto my cubicle. The back of my neck flared with sudden heat. He moved through the aisles. He didn't walk so much as part the air around him. Employees physically shrank back into their desks as he passed, overwhelmed by the dense, heavy scent of rain and asphalt that rolled off him. It was a suffocating aura of authority. He stopped directly in front of my desk. Greg squeaked, physically stumbling back from his own partition. I slowly took my hands off the keyboard and looked up. Up close, Pierce looked rested. The dark circles were gone, replaced by a terrifying clarity. He stared at me. I stared back, painfully aware of my wrinkled button-down and the cheap, itching scent blockers on my pulse points. "Mr. Pierce," I said, my voice sounding incredibly loud in the dead silent room. "Are you lost? The executive suites are 28 floors up." The VP of operations gasped softly behind him. Pierce didn't even blink. "Ethan Finch," Pierce said. He didn't ask. He stated my name like a fact he had memorized and filed away. "Data analyst 2, 3 years at the company. Mediocre performance reviews citing a lack of ambition and poor team integration." I felt my face heat. "I'm efficient," I said tightly. "I just don't like trust falls." Pierce ignored my defense. He reached up his large hand, gently cupping the back of the sleeping baby's head. "She slept for 7 hours straight last night," he said quietly. The words were simple, but the intensity behind them was staggering. "She hasn't slept more than 2 hours at a time since she was brought to me 3 weeks ago." "Congratulations," I said, pushing my chair back an inch. "Parenting is a steep learning curve. I'm sure you'll get the hang of it. I'm not a man who relies on hoping to get the hang of things, Mr. Finch. I find solutions. I optimize." He stepped closer to my desk. The scent of asphalt and ozone washed over me, heavy and dominant. My instincts screamed at me to bare my neck to submit to the sheer physical pressure of the alpha standing over me. I dug my fingernails into my thighs, maintaining eye contact out of pure stubborn spite. "I don't see how your optimization involves me." I lied. I saw exactly where this was going, and panic was cold and bright in my chest. "You stabilized her," Pierce stated, leaning slightly over my desk. "I require that stability. You are being transferred to the executive floor effective immediately. Your new title will be Executive Assistant to the CEO. Your salary will be tripled. Your duties will consist entirely of remaining in my immediate vicinity and handling Sophie when she becomes inconsolable." He said it like he was ordering office supplies. I stared at him, my brain stalling out. You want to hire me as a pacifier. I am hiring you as an asset. I'm an analyst." I snapped, keeping my voice low, but letting the anger bleed through. "I work with data. I don't work with infants. And I definitely don't work as a biological soothing mechanism for a man who doesn't know how to hold his own kid." The silence in the room deepened. I could feel Greg mentally writing my obituary. Pierce's eyes narrowed. The air grew perceptibly heavier. "I am not asking, Mr. Finch. I am informing you." "And I'm declining," I said, grabbing my lukewarm coffee. My hand was shaking slightly, so I set it back down. "I like my boring job. I like the 14th floor. You can't just buy my biology because you're having a hard time adjusting." "Watch me," Pierce said softly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a sleek black key card on a lanyard, and dropped it onto my keyboard. It landed with a heavy final clack. "Your current desk will be cleared out by security within the hour," Pierce said, turning away. "I expect you in my office by 10. If she wakes up before then, I will send someone to fetch you." He walked away, the VP scurrying after him like a frightened terrier. The heavy scent of the alpha lingered long after the elevator doors closed behind him. I stared at the black keycard resting on my keyboard. The plastic was glossy, reflecting the dull fluorescent lights of the ceiling. It looked like a leash. I rubbed my itching neck, a cold, cynical realization settling into my bones. My quiet, boring life was over. The billionaire had found a tool he needed, and alphas like Noah Pierce never ever let go of what they claimed. The 42nd floor didn't hum. It breathed. It was a vast, silent expanse of frosted glass white oak and brushed steel suspended high above the smog line. When the elevator doors whispered open, my cheap cardboard box of desk belongings felt suddenly heavy, like a beacon of poverty in a museum. "Mr. Finch." A woman materialized from behind a minimalist reception desk. She wore a tailored cream dress and smelled of absolutely nothing. A beta. Her badge read Chloe. She looked at my wrinkled slacks and the scuffed toes of my loafers with polite clinical indifference. "I'm Ethan," I said, shifting the box. My stapler rattled against my coffee mug. "I guess I work here now." "Mr. Pierce is expecting you. Follow me, please." We walked down a corridor that felt impossibly wide. My generic scent blockers were itching fiercely against my collar. The air up here was aggressively sanitized, but underneath the expensive HVAC filtration, the faint, heavy baseline of Noah Pierce's scent lingered. Rain on hot asphalt. It was a territorial marker pressed into the very fibers of the plush carpet. My pulse kicked up a notch, a deeply ingrained biological response I aggressively tried to swallow. Chloe opened a heavy oak door. "Your office." It wasn't an office. It was a luxury holding cell. It was larger than my entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, vertigo-inducing view of the city sprawl. There was a sleek desk in the corner equipped with top-of-the-line monitors, but the center of the room was dominated by a plush dove-gray sofa and a high-end self-rocking bassinet. A changing station was built discreetly into custom cabinetry against the far wall. "There's an adjoining door to Mr. Pierce's private suite," Chloe said, gesturing to a solid wood door on the left. "You are not to enter unless summoned or if the infant is distressed. Your schedule is dictated by her sleep cycles." "What about my actual work?" I asked, setting my sad little box on the $5,000 desk. "The data analysis and ISO." Chloe offered a tight, professional smile. "You are an executive assistant now, Mr. Finch. Your primary objective is listed in your revised contract." She handed me a leather-bound folder. I didn't need to open it. I was a professional pacifier. The door behind me clicked open. The temperature in the room dropped. The scent of asphalt and ozone flooded the space heavy enough to make my teeth ache. Noah Pierce stepped into my office. He had discarded his suit jacket, wearing only a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked massive without the tailoring all broad shoulders and coiled, restless energy. In his arms, Sophie was beginning to fuss. It was a low, reedy sound, the precursor to a meltdown. Pierce didn't look at me. He walked straight to the sofa, his jaw tight. "She refuses the bottle. The temperature is exactly 98 degrees. The formula is the brand recommended by the pediatrician." "She's not a chemistry experiment," I muttered, rubbing the back of my neck. My skin was raw from the blockers. "Sometimes they just want to be held differently." Pierce stopped. He turned to me, his gray eyes pinning me to the spot. "Then hold her differently." He stepped into my space, closing the distance until the toes of his polished Oxfords brushed my loafers. The sheer physical heat radiating off him was jarring. He held the baby out. I hesitated. Every instinct I had, honed over a decade of corporate survival, screamed at me to keep my distance, to refuse. Engaging meant dropping my blockers. Dropping my blockers meant exposing my biology to an alpha who could crush me with a thought. Sophie let out a sharp, jagged cry. My chest tightened. It was an involuntary physical ache. I hated it. I hated the biological programming that made my arms twitch toward the sound of a distressed pup. Swallowing a bitter curse, I reached out and took her. She was a solid, warm weight. She smelled like sour milk and the sharp tang of her father's frustration. "I need space," I said, looking up at Pierce. He was standing entirely too close, looming over us, watching my hands. "You're hovering. Your scent is making her anxious." A muscle jumped in his cheek. He didn't like taking orders, especially not in his own domain. But he took one step back. I turned away from him, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows. I closed my eyes, took a shallow breath, and consciously dropped the mental wall holding back my scent. The itch on my neck burned for a second before fading into a dull ache. My natural scent, dry earth, old books, steeped tea bled into the sanitized air. It felt incredibly invasive, like stripping down to my underwear in a glass box. I shifted Sophie, tucking her head under my chin, and began the slow, rhythmic sway of my hips. I didn't hum. I just breathed. Within 90 seconds, the tension bled out of her tiny spine. Her cries hitched, turning into soft, wet exhales. She rooted against my collarbone for a moment, finding no food, and then simply settled her cheek, resting heavily against my chest. Silence descended on the room. I stood there staring blindly at the city traffic miles below, holding a billionaire's child, feeling profoundly compromised. "Put her in the bassinet," Pierce commanded softly from behind me. "If I put her down now, she'll wake up." I kept my voice low, not turning around. "Give it 10 minutes for her to hit deep sleep." I heard the rustle of his clothes. He didn't leave. He simply stood behind me, close enough that I could feel the radiant heat of his body waiting. The air in the room was a chaotic mix. The expensive ozone of the filtration system, the sharp, heavy rain of the alpha, and the quiet, boring earth of my own scent. It was an unnatural ecosystem, and I was trapped right in the center of it. 2 weeks. It took exactly 2 weeks for the 42nd floor to strip away the last of my patients. The routine was a grinding psychological endurance test. Pierce spent his days in back-to-back meetings, orchestrating corporate buyouts behind his solid oak door. I spent my days in the luxury holding cell staring at spreadsheets I wasn't allowed to touch, waiting for the intercom to buzz. When it did, Chloe would appear with a squalling Sophie handing her over like a ticking bomb. The physical toll was mounting. You aren't supposed to drop and raise your scent barriers 5 times a day. It's like turning a rusty valve on and off. Eventually the pipes crack. The skin on my neck wrists and the dip behind my ears was inflamed, a rash forming from the cheap chemical gel I desperately applied every morning to maintain my boundaries. It was a Tuesday. It was raining, a gray, miserable downpour that streaked the glass of my floor-to-ceiling windows. Sophie was crying. It wasn't an angry cry. It was a tired, persistent whine. I was pacing the length of the sofa, my blockers down, letting the scent of dry earth fill the room. She was heavy today, fighting sleep, burying her little fists into the collar of my cheap beige cardigan. The connecting door to Pierce's office swung open. I didn't stop pacing. I didn't look up. I just kept swaying, patting the rhythm against her diaper. Pierce stood in the doorway. He was on a phone call holding a sleek black cell to his ear. Tell the board I won't accept less than a 60% controlling stake. If they balk, bleed them on the stock price until Friday. He ended the call, sliding the phone into his pocket. He didn't go back to his desk. He walked into my office, his eyes tracking my pacing. She has been crying for 12 minutes, Pierce said, his voice flat. She's fighting a nap, I replied, my voice raspy. I was exhausted. The constant whiplash of his dominating pheromones was giving me chronic migraines. She's human, Mr. Pierce. There is no off switch. He walked closer. He stopped right in my path, forcing me to halt my pacing. I looked up, glaring. Up close, the contrast between us was painfully obvious. He was immaculate, wrapped in thousands of dollars of Italian wool smelling like power and cold rain. I was wearing slacks I bought at a discount store, a cardigan stained with spit up, and I smelled like a used bookstore mixed with chemical burn. Pierce didn't look at the baby. He looked at my neck. His nostrils flared. His brow furrowed in sharp, sudden disgust. What is that smell? I froze. It's just me. No, it isn't. He stepped closer, invading my personal space. The heavy weight of his alpha aura pressed down on me, making my knees want to buckle. I locked my joints, staring defiantly at his silk tie. Beneath your scent, it smells like battery acid and burnt plastic. It's abrasive. I reached up defensively, my hand covering the angry red skin over my scent gland. It's my blockers. The gel. Pierce's eyes narrowed. He reached out. Before I could dodge, his large, cool fingers wrapped around my wrist, pulling my hand away from my neck. His thumb brushed against the inflamed skin over my pulse point. I hissed, jerking back. The touch was electric, a sudden shocking transfer of heat that made my breath catch. Pierce didn't let go. His grip was a vice holding my wrist suspended between us. He stared at the angry red rash, his expression darkening into a storm front. The scent in the room violently shifted. The cold rain turned into the heavy, suffocating smell of an incoming hurricane. It was pure territorial displeasure. You are burning your own skin, he said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on that vibrating resonance that rattled my ribs. It's mandatory for unbonded omegas in the corporate sectors. I said through gritted teeth, trying to pull my arm back. He didn't budge. I have to wear it. It keeps me employed. I employ you, Pierce stated. He let go of my wrist, but he didn't back away. You are enclosed in a private suite. The only people who enter are myself, Chloe, and the infant. Your blockers are irritating her. They're irritating you. I shot back, the exhaustion overriding my survival instincts. Sophie doesn't care, but they ruin your perfect sanitized environment. Take them off, he ordered. No. Pierce went completely still. I don't think anyone had told him no to his face in a decade. His eyes locked onto mine, icy and lethal. I am not asking Finch. You are causing yourself physical harm with a substandard chemical paste, and the smell is deeply offensive. Wash it off. If I wash it off, I am entirely exposed. I snapped, shifting Sophie's weight defensively. I am an unbonded omega trapped in a room with an alpha. Do you have any idea how psychologically taxing that is? The blockers are my only wall. I'm not taking down my front door just because you don't like the paint color. We stared at each other. The air was so thick with conflicting pheromones, my spiked defensive tea scent clashing with his dark rolling storm, that it felt hard to breathe. Sophie whimpered in her sleep, burying her face deeper into my chest to escape the tension. Pierce looked at the baby, then back at me. Slowly, the hurricane receded. He pulled his dominance back, leashing it with a terrifying amount of control. There is a full bathroom attached to this suite. Pierce said, his voice devoid of any inflection. It is stocked with hypoallergenic soap. Wash your neck. If you apply that acid to your skin again, I will have the building's security confiscate it from your bag. He turned on his heel and walked back into his office, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. I stood alone in the quiet room, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I looked down at the sleeping infant, then at the closed door. He wasn't just managing me anymore. He was managing my environment. He was dictating my biology. The cage was getting smaller. 3 days later, the air conditioning on the 42nd floor broke. It wasn't a total failure, just a sluggishness in the system that let the afternoon heat creep against the glass windows, turning my office into a greenhouse. I had my sleeves rolled up, sweating through my button-down. I had obeyed Pierce. I stopped using the blockers. The result was an agonizing vulnerability. Without the chemical barrier, I felt like a raw nerve. Every time the adjoining door opened, Pierce's scent hit me unfiltered. I could map his moods by smell. A sharp metallic tang meant a bad meeting. A deep, heavy petrichor meant he was focused. The constant exposure was wearing down my resistance, making my body hyper-aware of his presence in the building. At 2 p.m., Chloe rushed into my office. She didn't knock. "She's sick," Chloe said, her usually perfectly composed face tight with panic. She was holding Sophie awkwardly away from her silk blouse. "She just threw up everywhere. She feels hot." I dropped my pen and practically vaulted over the desk. I snatched the baby from the beta. Sophie was radiating heat. Her face was flushed, her eyes glazed, and she was letting out a weak, pathetic mewl that sounded completely different from her usual angry screams. She smelled of sour stomach acid and the frightening metallic scent of a sick pup. "Did you call the pediatrician?" I asked, laying her gently on the changing table and quickly stripping off her soiled onesie. "I'm paging them now," Chloe said, pulling out her phone. "Mr. Pierce is in the boardroom, the Japanese merger. They've been in there for 4 hours. It's the final negotiations." "Get a cool cloth." I barked, not caring that she technically outranked me. I pressed the back of my hand to Sophie's forehead. It was burning. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. My instincts screamed. Without thinking, I flooded the room with my scent, pushing out the thickest, heaviest wave of calming earth and tea I could manage, trying to blanket her in it. The adjoining door didn't just open, it slammed against the wall. Noah Pierce stood in the doorway. He looked terrible. His tie was loosened, his hair was ruffled, and his eyes were wild. The scent pouring off him was terrifying, pure, unadulterated alpha terror and aggression. The ozone smell was so thick it tasted like blood on the back of my tongue. He crossed the room in 2 strides, shoving Chloe roughly out of the way. "What happened?" he demanded, his hands hovering over the changing table, shaking. "She has a fever," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my hands were trembling under the weight of his pheromones. "Chloe is calling the doctor. Don't touch her. Your hands are freezing." Pierce didn't listen. He reached down his large hand, cupping the side of her flushed face. Sophie whimpered at the cold contact and weakly turned her head away, rooting blindly toward my chest. "She's burning up." Pierce breathed, his voice cracking. He looked at me, his gray eyes blown wide, stripped of all corporate armor. He looked like a man watching his world burn. "Finch, fix it. Do something." "I'm not a doctor," I snapped, grabbing a wet wipe and carefully cleaning the sick off her chin. "I'm keeping her calm. You need to back up. Your scent is suffocating her. You smell like a predator." Pierce flinched. The words hit him like a physical blow. He looked down at his shaking hands, then at his daughter, who was crying weakly, trying to press herself closer to my wrists. He didn't back away. Instead, he did something worse. He stepped directly behind me. Before I could react, I felt the solid, immovable wall of his chest press against my back. His hands came down on either side of me, gripping the edge of the changing table, trapping me between the wood and his body. I gasped. The physical contact was overwhelming. The heat of him seeped right through my shirt. He lowered his head, his face burying into the curve of my neck right over the scent gland where my blockers used to be. He inhaled. Deeply. Pierce. I choked out a full-body shiver racking my spine. My knees turned to water. The raw, aggressive dominance of his proximity was short-circuiting my brain. "Don't move!" He growled against my skin, the vibration of his voice traveling straight down my spine. "Just don't move." I realized what he was doing. He wasn't attacking. He was drowning. The panic of his sick child was breaking his control, and he was using the thick, heavy pool of my calming scent to ground himself. He was breathing me in like oxygen. I stood frozen, trapped between the sick baby and the desperate alpha. I kept one hand on Sophie's chest, feeling her rapid heartbeat, while Pierce's erratic, heavy breathing washed over my neck. The heavy storm of his scent began to slow, merging violently with my dry earth and tea. He was leaning his full weight against me. I was holding them both together. Chloe stood frozen in the corner, staring at us with wide, horrified eyes. She had her phone pressed to her ear, but she wasn't speaking. "The doctor—" I forced the words out, my voice sounding incredibly fragile in the quiet room. "Tell the doctor she's lethargic." Pierce didn't lift his head. His nose brushed against my bare pulse point, a fleeting, intimate friction that made my breath hitch. I squeezed my eyes shut, a bitter realization settling heavy in my gut. I was supposed to be a tool to fix the baby. But as the alpha's hands tightened on the table beside my hips, grounding himself in my space, my scent, my biology, I knew the dynamic had fundamentally shattered. He wasn't just using me for her anymore. He was using me for him. The pediatrician arrived in 12 minutes. It felt like 12 hours. Dr. Evans was a brusque, no-nonsense beta who barely blinked at the chaotic scene in the office. He checked Sophie's ears, listened to her chest, and diagnosed a mild ear infection. He prescribed antibiotics, infant Tylenol, and rest. Through the entire examination, Noah Pierce stood exactly 1 foot behind my right shoulder. He hadn't retreated. When Chloe had finally guided the doctor into the room, Pierce had only stepped back enough to allow the man access to the changing table. But his hand had remained firmly wrapped around the back of my desk chair, his knuckles white his scent, a heavy, brooding storm cloud that filled every corner of the room. I was shaking. The adrenaline crash was brutal, leaving my limbs feeling like lead and my stomach hollow. "Keep her hydrated," Dr. Evans said, packing his stethoscope into a worn leather bag. "The fever should break by morning. If it spikes past 103, take her to the emergency room. Good luck." He left. Chloe scurried out behind him, closing the heavy oak door with a quiet, terrified click. We were alone again. Sophie lay on the table exhausted and heavily medicated, finally dozing. She looked incredibly small. I leaned heavily against the wood, bracing my weight on my palms, staring down at her flushed cheeks. "Finch." Pierce's voice was rough. It sounded like it had been dragged over gravel. I didn't turn around. "She's fine," I said, my own voice lacking any real volume. "It's just an ear infection. Babies get them. It's normal." Nothing about the last hour was normal. He moved closer. The heat of his body radiated against my back again. I squeezed my eyes shut. I was too tired to put up a fight, too drained to rebuild the mental walls I had collapsed to flood the room with my scent. My neck was bare, exposed, and pulsing with a dull ache. "I'm taking her home," Pierce stated. "Good idea," I said, pushing off the table. I grabbed my cardigan from the back of the sofa, slipping my arms into the sleeves. The cheap wool felt abrasive against my sensitized skin. "She needs her crib. I'll see you both tomorrow. Call me if you are coming with us." I froze one arm halfway into my sleeve. I turned to look at him. He was already shrugging into his suit jacket, his face a mask of absolute unyielding stone. The panic from 20 minutes ago was gone, locked away behind a vault of corporate control, but his eyes were dark. Fixated. "No, I'm not," I said flatly. "My shift is over in 20 minutes. I'm going to my apartment. I'm going to drink a cheap beer, watch terrible television, and sleep." Pierce stopped buttoning his jacket. He looked at me, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "She is sick. She requires your scent." "She requires medication, which she just got," I argued, my voice rising. I pointed a finger at him. "You don't get to do this. You bought my 9 to 5, you bought my desk, you don't own my evenings. I am going home." I turned my back on him, grabbed my canvas messenger bag, and headed for the door. I didn't make it 3 steps. Pierce's hand clamped down on my shoulder. It wasn't a gentle guiding touch. It was a heavy, immovable weight that stopped my forward momentum instantly. He spun me around, pushing me backward until my spine hit the frosted glass wall of the office. The glass was cold. His hand was burning. "Let go of me," I snapped, bringing my hands up to shove at his chest. It was like pushing against a concrete pillar. He didn't budge. He stepped into my space, trapping me between the glass and his body. The scent of ozone and wet asphalt hit me like a physical blow so dense I choked on it. My instincts flared a terrifying mix of submission and raw, cornered anger. "Your apartment is a 4th-floor walk-up in a neighborhood with a 30-minute response time for emergency services." Pierce said, his voice dropping into that terrifying, vibrating resonance. He leaned in, his face inches from mine. "The windows rattle. The heating is inconsistent. You eat sodium-heavy takeout 4 nights a week." My blood ran cold. "You ran a background check on me. I ran a comprehensive audit on the environment of the man who holds my daughter," he corrected smoothly. "It is inadequate. My penthouse is temperature-controlled. The security is absolute. There is a pediatrician on retainer in the building." "I don't care." I breathed, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I'm not your property. You can't just box me up and take me home." Pierce's eyes dropped to my neck. He stared at the bruised raw skin over my scent gland. He lifted his free hand, his thumb brushing slowly, deliberately over the racing pulse point there. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. My knees betrayed me, trembling under the sudden intense surge of alpha pheromones. I hated it. I hated my body for reacting to the dominance, for wanting to yield to the overwhelming strength pressing me against the glass. "You stabilized her," Pierce whispered, leaning closer. His breath fanned across my cheek. "And you stabilized me. I do not let go of what keeps my foundation intact. You're coming home with us, Ethan." It was the first time he had used my first name. It sounded like a padlock snapping shut. He didn't wait for my answer. He turned away, scooped the sleeping baby carefully from the changing table, and walked out the door. He knew I would follow. He had stripped away my blockers, exposed my biology, and tied my instincts to the heavy sleeping weight in his arms. I stood against the cold glass for 10 seconds, grinding my teeth until my jaw ached. Then, smelling the lingering trace of his rain-heavy scent fading down the corridor, I picked up my cheap canvas bag and followed him to the elevator. The penthouse didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum exhibit dedicated to the concept of extreme wealth. It occupied the entire top floor of a glass skyscraper. The floors were poured concrete, the furniture was sharp and minimalist, and the art on the walls was terrifyingly abstract. It was silent. A heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against my eardrums the moment the private elevator doors opened. "Your room is down the East Hall," Pierce said, not looking back as he carried Sophie toward a nursery that was probably larger than my entire apartment. "Dinner is catered at 8. That was 3 days ago. I hadn't left. I told myself it was because Sophie was still recovering, still fussy, and clinging to the scent of my cardigan. But the cold truth was that leaving required an active, exhausting fight against my own biology. The penthouse was saturated with Pierce's scent. It was in the expensive sheets, the filtered air, the leather of the sofas. My body was acclimatizing to the alpha's territory, settling into a deeply ingrained, humiliating state of domestic compliance. It was 2 a.m. on a Friday. The city below was a sprawling grid of orange and white lights. I was in the kitchen, standing barefoot on the freezing concrete floor, waiting for the electric kettle to boil. I couldn't sleep. The mattress in the guest room was too soft, the thread count too high. I missed the rattle of my radiator. I missed the smell of cheap coffee. The kettle clicked off. I poured the hot water over a cheap tea bag I had smuggled in my messenger bag. You shouldn't be awake. I jumped sloshing boiling water onto the granite counter. Noah Pierce stood in the doorway. He was wearing dark sweatpants and a tight gray t-shirt. The corporate armor was entirely stripped away, leaving only the raw, imposing reality of the man. His hair was messy. He looked exhausted, the dark circles back under his eyes. "Neither should you," I said, grabbing a paper towel to wipe up the spill. I didn't look at him. The kitchen felt suddenly impossibly small. He walked in. He didn't turn on the overhead lights, leaving us illuminated only by the faint blue glow of the refrigerator and the ambient city light bleeding through the windows. He stopped beside the island counter a few feet away from me. He watched me squeeze the tea bag with the back of a spoon. "She slept through the night," he said quietly. "The antibiotics are working," I replied, bringing the mug to my lips. The cheap chamomile tasted like dust and comfort. "She'll be back to terrorizing your board members by Monday." Silence stretched between us. It wasn't the hostile silence of the office, but something heavier, thicker. "I didn't want her," Pierce said suddenly. I lowered my mug. I stared at him. It was a shocking admission, brutal in its honesty. Pierce was looking out the window, his profile sharp against the city lights. Her mother was a brief arrangement, a calculated risk that produced an uncalculated variable. When she dropped her off with my legal team a month ago, relinquishing all rights, I viewed it as a logistical failure. I hired the best nannies, the best pediatricians. I bought the optimal equipment. He turned his head slowly, his gray eyes locking onto mine in the dim light. None of it worked. She screamed until she bled. And I realized for the first time in my life that I possessed a problem that my money, my intelligence, and my authority could not fix. I was entirely, profoundly powerless. He took a step toward me. The scent of rain and asphalt rolled off him heavy and dark with memory. "Then you stepped into my elevator." Pierce continued, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. He took another step. "You smelled like dry dirt and cheap tea. You looked at me with absolute contempt, and you fixed it." "I just held her," I said, my voice barely audible. My heart was slamming against my ribs. I backed up until my hips hit the edge of the granite counter. There was nowhere else to go. Pierce stopped right in front of me. The heat radiating off him was immense. He reached out his large hands, gripping the edge of the counter on either side of my hips, caging me in exactly as he had in the office. "You grounded her," Pierce said, leaning down. His face was inches from mine. His eyes were dark, searching my face with a terrifying intensity. "You grounded me. I'm your employee." I whispered, a desperate final attempt to throw up a boundary. "You pay me to be here. I pay you to stay," Pierce corrected softly. "I would burn the company to the ground before I let you leave." He didn't give me time to process the weight of that statement. He moved. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. His mouth crashed down on mine, hot and desperate. There was no hesitation, no polite asking for permission. It was an alpha claiming a biological necessity. I gasped against his lips, my hands flying up to push against his chest. But the moment my palms hit the solid, warm muscle beneath his shirt, the fight drained out of me. The scent of ozone and heavy rain violently swamped my senses, drowning out my quiet tea and earth. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. It felt exactly like falling. His hands released the counter wrapping around my waist, lifting me effortlessly until I was sitting on the cold granite. He stepped between my knees, pulling me flush against his chest. His grip was bruising his fingers, digging into my hips as his mouth devoured mine. He tasted like expensive scotch and sharp, desperate relief. I made a sound in the back of my throat, a pathetic whining noise of total biological surrender. I hated it. I hated the weakness. But my hands curled into his t-shirt, pulling him closer, my fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. I kissed him back, matching his desperate bruising rhythm. I bit his lower lip, a flash of cynical rebellion, and he groaned a low rumbling sound that vibrated straight through my core. He buried his face into the side of my neck. his hot breath ghosting over my bare, sensitized scent gland. I arched my back, exposing it entirely, the final wall crumbling into dust. Mine, he breathed against my skin, his teeth scraping lightly over my pulse point. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It was a factual statement. I closed my eyes, the city lights blurring behind my eyelids. The cage door hadn't just slammed shut. I had reached out and locked it myself. The morning light was harsh, blindingly white as it bounced off the pouring concrete floor. I woke up tangled in sheets that cost more than my car. The bed was massive, smelling aggressively of Noah Pierce. I lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, feeling the heavy phantom ache of his grip on my hips and the lingering heat of his mouth on my skin. I turned my head. The other side of the bed was empty, the sheets cool. A wave of cynical dread washed over me. Of course. The Alpha had secured his asset, established his dominance, and gone back to his spreadsheets. I was an idiot. I had traded my independence for a granite countertop and a biological high. I dragged myself out of bed, grabbing a discarded t-shirt from the floor, his smelling of rain and sweat, and pulled it over my head. It hung past my thighs. I padded barefoot down the wide, silent hallway, bracing myself for the cold reality of the day. I would pack my cheap canvas bag. I would write a resignation letter on his $5,000 desk. I would leave. I pushed open the door to the kitchen. I stopped dead in my tracks. Noah Pierce was standing at the stove. He was wearing his suit trousers and a crisp white shirt, but the collar was open and his sleeves were rolled up. In one hand, he held a sleek black frying pan awkwardly scrambling eggs. In his other arm, strapped securely to his chest in the tactical carrier, was Sophie. She was awake, chewing happily on the collar of his expensive shirt, drooling a massive wet patch onto the imported cotton. Pierce wasn't bouncing frantically. He wasn't radiating panic. He was swaying a slow, rhythmic movement from the hips. It was clumsy and unnatural mimicry of my own motion, but he was doing it. He turned his head as I walked in. His eyes dropped, taking in his oversized t-shirt hanging off my frame, my bare legs, my messy hair. The scent in the room shifted immediately, a thick, heavy wave of smug satisfaction and territorial possession rolling off him. It made my pulse flutter traitorously. "You're awake," he said, turning back to the stove. "The eggs are slightly overcooked. I am unaccustomed to the heat distribution of this pan." I stood frozen. "What are you doing?" "I am making breakfast," he said, shifting Sophie slightly to grab a spatula. He looked down at the baby, his expression softening into something incredibly vulnerable, a crack in the ice that took my breath away. "She woke up an hour ago. She did not scream. I managed to change her without incident." He looked back at me, the ice returning sharp and calculating. "I am learning the mechanics of this, but I am not doing it alone." I walked slowly into the kitchen, the cold concrete biting into my bare feet. I stopped beside the island. "Last night," I started, my voice raspy. "Last night was a clarification of terms." Pierce interrupted smoothly. He scraped the eggs onto 2 porcelain plates. He set one down on the island in front of me. "You're not leaving this apartment. You're not returning to the 14th floor. You're mine. She is ours." It was the most arrogant, commanding, terrifying thing I had ever heard. I should have run. I should have thrown the plate at his head and called the police. I looked down at the eggs. They were in fact burnt. I looked up at him. The billionaire who didn't know how to cook, wearing a baby, covered in spit-up, demanding my absolute surrender over ruined breakfast. Underneath the heavy, dominant ozone of his scent, I caught the faint, desperate undertone of fear. He was terrified I would walk out that door. He was building the gilded cage as fast as he could, trying to trap me before I realized I held all the keys. I sighed. The exhaustion settled deep into my bones, a comfortable heavy weight. "I'm not eating these," I said, pushing the plate away. "They're charcoal." Pierce's jaw tightened. I followed the instructions. "Give me the baby." I interrupted, stepping around the island. He hesitated, his alpha instincts flaring at the command, but then he carefully unclipped the carrier. He handed Sophie to me. She immediately grabbed a fistful of my messy hair and giggled, her tiny nose burying into my chest, inhaling the scent of dry earth and tea. I rested her on my hip, feeling the solid, perfect weight of her against my side. I looked at Pierce. He was watching me, his eyes dark, his chest rising and falling heavily. "If I stay," I said, keeping my voice flat, holding his gaze. "I picked the groceries. No more catered sodium-free cardboard, and you don't dictate my wardrobe." Pierce stared at me. Slowly, a smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. It was a rare, genuine expression that transformed his face, making him look devastatingly handsome and utterly ruthless. "Acceptable parameters," he murmured. He stepped closer, invading my space with the effortless entitlement of a man who owned the building. He leaned down, bypassing my lips, and pressed a hard, possessive kiss directly over the bruised scent gland on my neck. I shivered, letting my head fall back, my own scent rising to meet his, wrapping the three of us in a chaotic, messy blend of rain, asphalt, earth, and tea. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a hostage negotiation disguised as domesticity. I was tied to a ruthless, emotionally stunted CEO and a screaming infant. The cage was locked, the key was thrown away, and the terrifying truth was, I had absolutely no desire to leave. If Ethan's surrender to the chaos of the Pierce penthouse left you breathless, or if you completely understand why he couldn't walk away from that burnt breakfast, hit that like button. This story proves that sometimes the strongest walls are brought down not by force, but by a crying baby and an alpha who finally admits he needs help. What did you think of Noah's chaotic attempt at cooking? Was Ethan right to stay? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow Omegaverse fans and subscribe for more deep emotional and grounded stories. See you in the next one.